All right, this is our Wednesday night Bible study, and we're in the book of Matthew, studying through it verse by verse. We're at the point where Jesus has entered into Jerusalem, and this is the last week of his life. And Matthew wants to give his readers a clear understanding of why the Pharisees, the religious leaders, felt it was necessary to put Jesus to death. And so in this next section, Jesus speaks all of these woes against the Pharisees, and then he starts talking about the destruction of Jerusalem and the end times, and you can just almost sense the religious leaders being so upset that Jesus is saying the end of their regime, the end of their control, the end of their leadership is what his kingdom is all about. And so I think putting him to death was a matter of their own personal survival, because the people clearly were listening to what Jesus was saying. So they had to find a way to discredit him as well as silencing him permanently, so that they could continue on with the kind of religious understanding that they had been teaching. So Jesus in chapter 23 is where we're beginning tonight. Jesus said to the crowds and to his disciples. It's important that we remember Matthew is giving us the context of where these conversations took place. The crowds are gathered around Jesus, listening to his every word, as well as his disciples are there. And the scribes and the Pharisees, and he said to them, the scribes and the Pharisees sit on Moses' seat. Therefore, do whatever they teach you and follow it. In other words, the religious leaders, the scribes, the Pharisees, are the official teachers of Judaism. He says, listen to what they teach you and follow it, the teaching of Moses. But, he continues, do not do as they do. In other words, they do not follow their own teaching, for they do not practice what they teach. And then he gives some examples. They tie up heavy burdens, hard to bear, and lay them on the shoulders of others, but they themselves are unwilling to lift a finger to move them. In other words, all of their rules, all of their practices of what it means to be a good Jew, to follow the law, etc., are so hard that the average person who was working all day long, etc., there's no way that they could fulfill all of the requirements that the Pharisees had. And the Pharisees do nothing to make their life easier so that they can at least feel about themselves like they are a Jew in good standing before God. Rather than what the Pharisees did is make people feel inadequate as religious Jews, and so they come into the temple hoping that God doesn't squish them or squash them because they're not keeping all of these rules that the Pharisees have laid down. So Jesus is speaking about that. They do all their deeds to be seen by others, for they make their phylacteries broad and their fringes long. In other words, one of the signs that you are a religious person, if you've ever seen an Orthodox Jew, the ends of their sleeves have these strings hanging down. These are phylacteries, and then they would have braid on the bottom of their robes. They would, which are again signs of spirituality. They love to have the place of honor at banquets and the best seats in the synagogues, and to be greeted with respect in the marketplaces, and to have people call them rabbi. They love it when people acknowledge their presence. You know, like they're, oh, Rabbi so-and-so's here. Please sit here. Please let everybody else get out of the way so Rabbi so-and-so can get whatever it is they wanted to get. Jesus says, but you are not to be called rabbi, for you have one teacher, and you are all students. In other words, Jesus is saying that God is our teacher, and all of us are followers. All of us are students, but they put themselves in the position of God, is what Jesus is saying. And call no one your father on earth, for you have one Father, the one in heaven. Wow. They'd love to be called Father so-and-so as a title of respect, as a title of their leadership, their care of others. And Jesus says, don't do that. You have one Father, and that's God who is in heaven. Nor are you to be called instructors, for you have one instructor, the Messiah. The greatest among you will be your servant, and all who exalt themselves will be humbled, and all who humble themselves will be exalted. Jesus says, don't seek to be exalted here, or in my kingdom you will be humbled. Seek rather to be humble here, and in my kingdom you will be exalted. What a different kind of way of thinking, especially if you're a Pharisee or a scribe or one of the other religious leaders. And then Jesus begins a series of what he starts with. These are called woes. And, the word woe is the word condemnation. They're condemned. The person who the woe is spoken of is a condemned person. And so he's speaking woes of the Pharisees and the scribes. Listen to what he says. But woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites, for you lock people out of the kingdom of heaven. For you do not go in yourselves, and when others are going in, you stop them. Woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites, for you cross sea and land to make a single convert, and you make the new convert twice as much a child of hell as yourself, by all of your rules, by all of your rituals and practices. He says you're condemned for that. Then he continues on. Woe to you, blind guides, who say, whoever swears by the sanctuary is bound by nothing, but whoever swears by the gold of the sanctuary is bound by the oath. Now, this is one of the traditions of the elders, that you made an oath when you made a sacrifice in the temple. But if you made the oath, he says here, by the sanctuary, you're not bound by that oath. But if you make the oath to the gold of the sanctuary, you're bound by the oath. He says, you blind fools. He says, for which is greater, the gold or the sanctuary that has made the gold sacred? Obviously, the sanctuary is greater, yet you make it lesser in this story about the oaths. And you say, whoever swears by the altar is bound by nothing, but whoever swears by the gift that is on the altar is bound by the oath. How blind you are! For which is greater, the gift or the altar that makes the gift sacred? So whoever swears by the altar swears by it and by everything on it. And whoever swears by the sanctuary swears by it and by the one who dwells in it. And whoever swears by heaven swears by the throne of God and by the one who is seated upon it. And now to trivialize the commitments that a person makes to God by saying, I swear by, the hair on my chinny chin chin, or something else, is trivializing the whole process. You're a blind guide. When you make an oath to God, it's binding upon you, period. It doesn't matter what you swear by. He continues on. Woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites, for you tithe mint, dill, and cumin, and have neglected the weightier matters of the law, justice and mercy and faith. It is these you ought to have practiced without neglecting the others. You blind guides, you strain out a gnat, but swallow a camel. In other words, they trivialize the whole process of living in a relationship with God. It's about keeping the little rules, the little tiny things of making sure if you have a garden, you tithe 10% of the dill that is grown in it, but you forget about mercy, you forget about justice, you forget about faith. And so it says, woe to you. You're condemned, Pharisees, you hypocrites. Verse 25, woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites, for you clean the outside of the cup and of the plate, but inside they are full of greed and self-indulgence. You blind Pharisee, first clean the inside of the cup, so that the outside may become clean. Again, Jesus has spoken to them many times about it's not what's on the outside, it's what's on the inside that's important. And their religious traditions and rituals made the system, made the trivial side of their practices important and neglected the weightier issues. And that's always what happens in religion. Religion gets more into the practice of the religion than it does get into the relationship that it's supposed to lead one to have with God. And so Jesus is saying, you're condemned because of that. Woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites, for you are like whitewashed tombs, which on the outside look beautiful, but inside they are full of bones of dead and all kinds of filth. So you also on the outside look righteous to others, but inside you are full of hypocrisy and lawlessness. Wow. You're condemned because of that. You care more about what people see than you care about who you really are. And Jesus says that's not the way of the kingdom. That's the way of condemnation. Woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites, for you build the tombs of the prophets and decorate the graves of the righteous. And you say, if we had lived in the days of our ancestors, we would not have taken part with them in shedding the blood of the prophets. This goes back to the Old Testament, where most of God's prophets were killed by the religious leaders of their day. And so Jesus is connecting that practice with the current Pharisees and scribes and religious leaders. He says, thus, you testify against yourselves that you are descendants of those who murdered the prophets. Fill up then the measure of your ancestors. You snakes, you brutal vipers, how can you escape being sentenced to hell? Therefore I send you prophets, sages, scribes, some of whom you will kill and crucify, and some you will flog in your synagogues and pursue from town to town, so that upon you may come all the righteous blood shed on earth, from the blood of righteous Abel to the blood of Zachariah son of Berechiah, whom you murdered between the sanctuary and the altar. Truly I tell you, all this will come upon this generation of scribes and Pharisees and religious leaders. They stand in a long line of the religious leaders of Israel who did not lead the people into a relationship with God. Instead, they led them into a relationship with religion, with ritual, with practice, with rules, with procedure, with behavior, and out of a relationship with God. And Jesus condemns them for that. He says, you will be condemned with all of the other religious leaders who killed the people God sent to them to show them the way. Parenthetically, the same way that you're going to kill me and to accomplish the same purpose. And then Jesus laments over Jerusalem. Jerusalem, Jerusalem, the city that kills the prophets and stones those who are sent to it. How often have I desired to gather your children together as a hen gathers her brood under her wings, and you were not willing. See, your house is left to you desolate. For I tell you, you will not see me again until you say, blessed is the one who comes in the name of the Lord. Jesus is saying, you've had your last chance. He said, how many times God has come to his people wanting to care for them like a mother hen cares for her chicks under their wings, and you would have none of it. You killed the prophets, you killed all of the people God sent to them, and now you are being left desolate with nothing. And then he continues on. As he came out of the temple and was going away, his disciples came to point out to him the buildings of the temple, these wonderful, beautiful buildings. And he said to them, you see all these, do you not? Truly, I tell you, not one stone will be left here upon another. All will be thrown down. The Jewish people looked to Jerusalem, they looked to the temple as that which gave them stability, that which gave them a sense of direction and purpose. It identified them as God's people. The temple is here. And Jesus is saying, I'm telling you, and this happened literally in 70 AD when the Romans siege on the city of Jerusalem, and when the Romans entered the city, they tore the temple and all of its buildings down, and not one stone was left standing upon another. And then when he was sitting on the Mount of Olives, the disciples came to him privately saying, "Tell us when this will be, and what will be the sign of your coming and at the end of the age?" Wow. The disciples come to Jesus and say, "Hey, let us know when this is going to happen so maybe we can leave Jerusalem before it takes place," or whatever else. Or maybe they just were, like the readers of the Inquirer, inquiring minds want to know. They wanted to know all these things because Jesus put some ideas in their head and they're saying, wow, when is this going to happen? Listen to how Jesus answers them. Jesus said, "Beware that no one leads you astray. For many will come in my name saying, 'I am the Messiah,' and they will lead many astray. And you will hear of wars and rumors of wars. See that you are not alarmed, for this must take place, but the end is not yet. For nation will rise against nation, and kingdom against kingdom, and there will be famines and earthquakes in various places. All this is but the beginning of the birth pangs." Jesus said the normal signs that people look for to say, wow, God is about ready to bring everything to closure. He says these are not the signs. He says these are the things that happen all the time. They're going to continue to happen, but don't think that that's making a statement about when the world's going to come to an end. How interesting that is, given that in the last 150 years, one of the things that the church has been all involved in is trying to set the date of when all these are coming. And they look at various situations. Even some people are talking about the coronavirus as one of the signs that Jesus coming is just around the corner, is soon. That, boy, all these things are coming together. Jesus says, beware of that. And now he's going to spend several teaching sessions talking about the end and when the end is coming. And his point is that all these things happen and they're so confusing. And then he's going to say, and no one knows, first of all, what they mean or when the end is going to happen. They're simply things that are going to take place in the world. And part of Matthew's gospel, Jesus gives the disciples the sense that these things are going to happen in their lifetime. And what you discover is that every generation since Jesus, all of these things have been taking place. There's never been 40 years that have been completely calm, where there's been no war, where there's been no natural disasters, where things like he's going to talk about have occurred. They occur all the time. So Jesus is saying, be real careful of trying to read the signs into the things that are going on around you. He's going to give us several parables where he says people are going to be surprised when I come. They're not going to be ready when I come. They're not going to be prepared because if they're waiting for these signs, all of these signs are not going to be what's going to tell when I'm coming. I'm coming when no one expects it. So be ready at all times is what his message is going to be. So listen to how he puts this. Then, this is the beginning of the birth pangs. Then they will hand you over to be tortured and will put you to death, and you will be hated by all nations because of my name. Then many will fall away, and they will betray one another and hate one another. And many false prophets will arise and lead many astray. And because of the increase of lawlessness, the love of many will grow cold. But the one who endures to the end will be saved. And this good news of the kingdom will be proclaimed throughout the world as a testimony to all the nations, and then the end will come. So Jesus is saying two things here that really are important. He says, no matter what goes on around you, the person who endures, who isn't trying to find a way out of it, who isn't trying to find a way of escape, who isn't trying to, play their cards right so that they don't have to go through all this stuff. He says the one who perseveres, who stays faithful until the end, that's the one who is saved. And then he says this, here's what has to happen before the end comes. The good news, the gospel, must be proclaimed throughout the world and as a testimony to all the nations everywhere, and then the end will come. When everyone has an opportunity to respond to God's grace in providing the sacrifice of his Son for the forgiveness of sins so that we can be in a relationship with God, when everyone has the opportunity to hear that, then the end will come, Jesus says. So, when you see the desolating sacrilege standing in the holy place, as was spoken of by the prophet Daniel, let the reader understand the prophecy of Daniel. He said, then those in Judea must flee to the mountains. The one on the housetop must not go down to take what is in the house. It is the one in the field must not turn back to get a coat. Woe to those who are pregnant and those who are nursing infants in those days. Pray that your flight may not be in winter or on a Sabbath, for at that time there will be great suffering, such as has not been from the beginning of the world until now. No, never will be. And if those days had not been cut short, no one would be saved. But for the sake of the elect, those days will be cut short. Then if anyone says to you, look, here is the Messiah, or there he is, do not believe it. For false messiahs and false prophets will appear and produce great signs and omens to lead astray, if possible, even the elect. Take note, I have told you beforehand, if they say to you, look, he's in the wilderness, do not go out. If they say, look, he's in the inner rooms, do not believe. For as the lightning comes from the east and flashes as far as the west, so will be the coming of the Son of Man. Wherever the corpse is, there the vultures will gather. Wow. Jesus is laying out pictures of horror that before he comes, there's awful things that are going to take place. And that's pretty much the world in which we've been living for the last 2,000 years. Immediately after the suffering of these days, the sun will be darkened, the moon will not give its light, the stars will fall from heaven, and the powers of heaven will be shaken. And then the sign of the Son of Man will appear in heaven, and then all the tribes of the earth will mourn, and they will see the Son of Man coming on the clouds of heaven with power and great glory, and he will send out his angels with a loud trumpet call, and they will gather his elect from the four winds, from one end of heaven to the other. Wow. Jesus is saying, on the day the Son of Man comes, he says he's coming for his own. He's coming for his own. And so as you're hearing this, you want to make sure that you're one of his own. Regardless of what's taking place around us, stay faithful, stay focused, because when he comes, and surely he is coming again, he will come for his own, those who have responded to God's grace. So from the fig tree, you remember the fig tree, its leaves withered. He says, so from the fig tree, learn its lesson. As soon as its branch becomes tender and puts forth its leaves, you know that summer is near. So also, when you see all these things, you know that he is near, at the very gates. Truly, I tell you, this generation will not pass away until all these things have taken place. Heaven and earth will pass away, but my words will not pass away. There's Jesus saying to his disciples, the generation that you're a part of is going to experience all of this. Is going to experience all of this. And it's going to continue to happen. And when he comes, we're going to see in a moment, we don't know when that's going to be. How many cycles of this terrible stuff that keeps happening on earth are we going to have to experience? Well, here's what he says about that in the next passage. But about the day and the hour, no one knows, not even the angels of heaven, nor the Son, but only the Father. For as the days of Noah were, so will be the coming of the Son of Man. For as in those days before the flood, they were eating and drinking, marrying and given in marriage until the day Noah entered the ark. And they knew nothing until the flood came and swept them all away. So too will be the coming of the Son of Man. People are not going to be able to figure out when to get ready, because when the Son of Man comes, it's going to be at an unexpected time. So the thing is, be ready. He says this, then two will be in the field, one will be taken, one will be left. Two women will be grinding meal together, one will be taken, the other will be left. Keep awake, therefore, for you do not know on what day your Lord is coming. But understand this, if the owner of the house had known in what part of the night the thief was coming, he would have stayed awake and would not have had to let his house be broken into. Therefore, you must also be ready, for the Son of Man is coming at an unexpected hour. The pursuit of trying to figure out when is a dead-end game. It can't be done. Even the Son doesn't know when. The angels don't know when. Only the Father knows when. It's going to happen as sure as shooting. So be ready, be watchful, be prepared, is what Jesus is saying. So, who then, Jesus continues, is the faithful and wise slave whom his master has put in charge of his household to give the other slaves their allowance of food at the proper time? Blessed is that slave whom his master will find at work when he arrives. When he comes back, he's still doing what he's been called to do. Truly, I tell you, he will put that one in charge of all his possessions. But if that wicked slave says to himself, my master is delayed, and he begins to beat his fellow slaves and eats and drinks with drunkards, the master of that slave will come on a day when he does not expect him, and at an hour that he does not know. And he will cut him in pieces and put him with the hypocrites, where there will be weeping and gnashing of teeth. What he's saying is maintain faithfulness until Jesus comes. Be ready every moment. He could come at any moment. So simply have your life in order. Make sure you're living in a relationship with the Father, so that when he comes, you will be one of those who are called with him, with all of the elect. Then he starts telling parables about this same issue. He says, then the kingdom of heaven. Now he's back to giving parallels or metaphors about the kingdom of heaven. Then the kingdom of heaven will be like this. 10 bridesmaids took their lamps and went to meet the bridegroom. 5 of them were foolish and 5 were wise. When the foolish took their lamps, they took no oil with them. But the wise took flasks of oil with their lamps. And as the bridegroom was delayed, all of them became drowsy and slept. But at midnight there was a shout, look, here's the bridegroom, come out to meet him. Then all those bridesmaids got up and trimmed their lamps. The foolish said to the wise, give us some of your oil, for our lamps are going out. But the wise replied, no, there will not be enough for you and for us. You had better go to the dealers and buy some for yourselves. And while I went to buy it, the bridegroom came, and those who were ready went with him into the wedding banquet, and the door was shut. Later the other bridesmaids came and said, Lord, Lord, open. But he replied, truly I tell you, I do not know you. Keep awake, therefore, for you know neither the day nor the hour. There Jesus is establishing once again that as certain as the bridegroom was coming, so the Son of Man is coming. So these things are going to happen. So the Messiah is coming back again. And so whatever your task is that you're called to do, make sure that you're doing it when he comes back so that you'll be ready. I like this last verse. Keep awake, therefore, for you know neither the day nor the hour. Keep awake. Keep alert. Always be prepared, because you don't know when it's going to happen. Don't think that you've got it figured out. You don't. Always be prepared. And now here we are 2,000 plus years later, and we're still waiting. We still need to be prepared for when he comes again. Then he tells another parable right after this one that connects with what he just said. He said, for it is as if a man going on a journey summoned his slaves and entrusted his property to them. To one he gave 5 talents, to another 2, to another 1, to each one according to his ability. Then he went away. The one who had received the 5 talents went off at once and traded with them and made 5 more talents. In the same way, the one who had the 2 talents made 2 more talents. And the one who had received the 1 talent went off and dug a hole in the ground and hid his master's money. Now after a long time, the master of those slaves came and settled accounts with them. Then the one who had received the 5 talents came forward, bringing 5 more talents, saying, Master, you handed over to me 5 talents. Look, I have made 5 more talents. His master said to him, well done, good and trustworthy slave. You have been trustworthy in a few things. I will put you in charge of many things. Enter into the joy of your master. And the one with the 2 talents also came forward, saying, Master, you handed over to me 2 talents, and look, I've made 2 more talents. His master said to him, "Well done, good and trustworthy slave. You have been trustworthy in a few things. I will put you in charge of many things. Enter into the joy of your master." Then the one who received the 1 talent also came forward, saying, "Master, I knew that you were a harsh man, reaping where you did not sow, and gathering where you did not scatter seed. So I was afraid, and I went and hid your talent in the ground. Here you have what is yours." But his master replied, "You wicked and lazy slave, you knew, did you, that I reap where I do not sow and gather where I did not scatter? Then you ought to have invested my money with the bankers, and on my return I would have received what was my own with interest. So take the talent from him, give it to the one with 10 talents, and to all of those who have, more will be given, and they will have an abundance. But from those who have nothing, even what they have will be taken away. As for this worthless slave, throw him into the outer darkness, where there will be weeping and gnashing of teeth." And that parable is encouraging us that as Jesus leaves, he's leaving us with a responsibility, with a task to be done. It's as Paul has said in 2 Corinthians that we've been talking about on Sunday mornings, that we have been given the responsibility of the ministry of reconciliation, that God is making his appeal through us. We're ambassadors of Christ, that this becomes a serious responsibility. So with our lives, with our words, with our actions, with the things that we're doing, we are investing our lives into the world around us in such a way that there's a return, that there's more people who come into the kingdom. So when the Lord comes back, there's fruit that we can demonstrate. There are people that we can look at and say, this person came to Christ because of the abilities, the skills that you gave me that I used for your kingdom purposes. But to not use what the Lord has given us is a horrible thing, like the slave who buried his talent and never did anything with it. There needs to be some kind of return. We're believers, we're Christians, and there's a responsibility that's been given to us that we need to accept and invest that responsibility, that gift in the world, so that we see a return. Then he continues on, talking about the same, the end of the world. He says, "When the Son of Man comes in his glory, and all the angels with him, then he will sit on the throne of his glory. And all the nations will be gathered before him, and he will separate people one from another, as a shepherd separates the sheep from the goats. And he will put the sheep at his right hand and the goats at his left. And then the king will say to those at his right hand, 'Come, you that are blessed by my Father, inherit the kingdom prepared for you from the foundation of the world. For I was hungry, and you gave me food. I was thirsty, and you gave me something to drink. I was a stranger, and you welcomed me. I was naked, and you gave me clothing. I was sick, and you took care of me. I was in prison, and you visited me.' Then the righteous will answer to him, 'Lord, when was it that we saw you hungry and gave you food, or thirsty and gave you something to drink? And when was it that we saw you a stranger and welcomed you, and naked and gave you clothing? And when was it that we saw you sick or in prison and visited you?' And the king will answer them, 'Truly I tell you, just as you did it to one of the least of these who are members of my family, you did it to me.' And then he will say to those at his left hand, 'You that are accursed, depart from me into the eternal fire prepared for the devil and his angels. For I was hungry, and you gave me no food. I was thirsty, and you gave me nothing to drink. I was a stranger, and you did not welcome me. Naked, and you did not give me clothing. Sick, and in prison, and you did not visit me.' And then they will also answer, 'Lord, when was it that we saw you hungry or thirsty or a stranger or naked or sick or in prison and did not take care of you?' And then he will answer them, 'Truly I tell you, just as you did not do it to one of the least of these, you did not do it to me. And these will go away into eternal punishment, but the righteousness into eternal life.'" Once again, Jesus is saying, what you do with what you have been given and to whom you do it to matters. I have given you all kinds of resources that you are to invest in people's lives around you, particularly those who need it, Remember, Jesus talks about the desire is to be least, and the person who's least in the kingdom becomes the greatest in the kingdom. And so your ministry needs to go to those who are least, and through your service they become great. That's why he says, it's, as you've done it to the least of these, you've done it to me. You've lifted them up to me. So the sense of being a part of the kingdom of heaven has a responsibility on it. And to take that responsibility and use it is the evidence that we're part of the kingdom, and that ends up having a tremendous reward. Now, as we get to chapter 26, as we'll see next week, as we continue on through 26, through the giving of the Lord's Supper, and through the time in Gethsemane, and his arrest and trial, etc., as things come to an end, we now begin to see, as we've listened to these passages tonight, as Jesus has spoken clearly, that the kingdom of heaven is a whole new entity, a whole new reality. Everything that exists now is coming to an end, and God's kingdom is beginning, and it is completely different. Now, when the religious leaders, the scribes, the Pharisees, have been here listening to Jesus teach, they hear what he's saying, and they know that it means an end to their control. If Jesus' kingdom is established, it means that the Jewish kingdom is gone, and they can't have that. So as we read in the beginning of chapter 26, when Jesus had finished saying all these things, he said to his disciples, "You know that after 2 days the Passover is coming, and the Son of Man will be handed over to be crucified." Again, he tells his disciples what's going to happen to him as a result of the words that he's been saying. Then the chief priests and the elders of the people gathered in the palace of the high priest, who was called Caiaphas, and they conspired to arrest Jesus by stealth and kill him. But they said, "Not during the festival, or there may be a riot among the people." The people are hearing Jesus. They're intrigued by what he's saying. I imagine they have a ton of questions, because even 2,000 years later, we have a ton of questions about these passages that we just read. But he's piqued their interest. They see him as a positive alternative to the kind of ruthless regime of religion that they've been under by following the religious leaders and the Pharisees, and they're welcoming his teaching, and the religious leaders are hating it, and they're trying to find a way to silence Jesus, to remove him from the scene. And the rest of the book is going to be talking about how the religious leaders accomplished that, in spite of the power that Jesus had in terms of the minds and the wills of the people. So it's a very interesting story that Matthew is writing to his Jewish readers to help them see that Jesus is the fulfillment of all of the hopes of Israel. It's a whole new thing. Follow him. Well, let's pray together as we close tonight. Lord, thank you for this book of Matthew. Thank you for Matthew giving us these powerful words in which Jesus is talking about the responsibility of those who have heard his words, and how we are to live while he is in heaven until he comes back again as our Messiah, and heaven becomes the reality of our lives. Lord, may we sense that responsibility to invest our lives in the needs and the cares and the issues of the world, so that there are more people coming into the kingdom because of that investment. Lord, help us to take that seriously, to hear those words, and to encourage each other to service, to ministry, to growing in our relationship with you. Thank you for the time that we've had together tonight, I pray. In Jesus' name, amen.